Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture about drugs. Today we're going to talk about crack and cocaine. And this is especially interesting from a sociological point of view because these are basically the same drug, but we treat them differently because racism. So, we have a lot to talk about today. Let's get started. Our first question, as always, is what is it? And the answer with this drug is a little bit complicated. So it all starts with the cocoa plant. This is the cocoa plant, you see, it's very green. From the cocoa plant, you make cocaine. From cocaine, you make crack. We're going to get into it in more detail, but the first thing that I wanted to explain are the crucial differences between cocaine and crack. There's a very helpful graph. Let's look at it. As you can see here, basically they come from the same thing, which is to say they come from the cocoa plant, which is then refined into cocaine. Both of them are addictive, and technically both of them can be injected. But one of the crucial differences is that cocaine is typically snorted through the nose, and crack is typically smoked. Cocaine also has a slower, more gradual high that lasts a little bit longer, whereas crack has a more quick and intense high, which lasts a shorter time. So what I'm going to do is talk about cocaine first, and then talk about crack. So let's get started with cocaine. So the history of cocaine is long and interesting. Humans have been chewing the cocoa leaf for thousands and thousands of years. The people who are native to the Andes Mountains have been chewing it since at least 3000 BC, maybe longer, and they chew it because it's a stimulant. So if you just chew on the leaf of the plant, you get a little pep in your step, and they did this to help them with farming and to help them with long hikes and also, for fun. When the Spanish conquistadors got there in the 1500s, they started forcing them to chew it, especially in the mines, which is a little darker. And then by the mid-1800s, people had figured out how to synthesize the drug cocaine out of the cocoa leaves. So this is where my arch nemesis Freud comes in. So, in the 1850s, basically a scientist in Germany had figured out how to extract just cocaine from the cocoa leaves, and they started using it for all sorts of things. Mostly, they used it as a numbing agent if you were going to have surgery on your eyeballs, or your mouth, or your nose, but then they started to notice that it might have other uses. They started using it to cure things like depression, hysteria in women, sexual impotency, all sorts of things. And Freud was really at the forefront of this movement. He wrote this really famous paper called Über Cocaine, which was basically about how cocaine was a wonder drug and it could cure all sorts of things. He started prescribing it to everybody, including his own girlfriend, including his best friends. He said that it didn't have a lethal dose, and then he found out when he killed one of his friends that it did have a lethal dose. So I hate Freud for a lot of reasons, but this is one of them. The way that cocaine is made is pretty complicated, and we don't have to get much into it, but as you can see here, basically you smush up the leaves, and you process them with a bunch of other chemicals, and you end up with a white powder. You can mix this powder with any liquid, and that's what people did in the beginning. They sold it in these little bottles at the drugstores, and it was really popular after the Civil War because a lot of people used it to wean themselves off of morphine, which of course backfired. But it wasn't considered dangerous. We saw it a lot in cough medicines, even in cough medicines for children. And it was readily available in pretty much every store. It was about 25 cents a gram, and you could just buy it over the counter. So for the first couple of decades of the 1900s, it was huge. Everyone in America was doing it. It was a problem, but we didn't necessarily think it was a problem. So basically, it was a really common drug until we realized that people were becoming addicted, and then it became illegal in 1914 during that drug law that we talked about that made all sorts of things illegal that used to be legal. So then it was sort of on the decline for several decades, especially in America. People weren't using it as much, people didn't really have access to it, but that all changed in the 1970s. So in the 70s, people started to want this drug because they had so much going on and they wanted to stay up and they wanted to party and they wanted to get business done. So a lot of business people and entertainers started using it. A lot of college students started using it where previously they hadn't. And basically it became the #1 party drug in America. So in the 70s, you've probably seen a lot of pictures of people doing this kind of thing. You've probably seen a lot of movies glorifying it. So it was a huge import in the 1970s, which led to, interestingly, a bit of a problem. The problem with having all of that cocaine was that actually we started to have too much cocaine. So there was a huge glut in the market in the 1980s. Basically, a lot of people had brought in a lot of cocaine, and there was so much that it was hard to make a profit from selling it anymore. So what they decided to do was to turn it into a separate drug and sell it differently. So they started mixing the cocaine with sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda, and water, and they turned the powder into a little rock, and then they sold that at a whole different price into a whole different group of people. So that's where crack came from. So now let's switch and talk about crack. So the thing that you need to know about crack is that they started selling it to a totally different brand of customer and in totally different places and in totally different quantities. So essentially, they took the same drug, but they made it into a different market. So if you see in this picture, for one thing, they started selling it in very small quantities. And they did this because it was easier to sell a small quantity to addicts who only had a little bit of money. They also started making it the main money earner in a lot of these neighborhoods. A lot of young black men started selling because there essentially weren't any other jobs available to them. These men specifically are from The Wire because I love that show, but it's a great depiction of the options that are available to men in certain neighborhoods. So what ended up happening was that it basically decimated the inner city black population. The young men started getting more violent, homicides doubled in a matter of 5 years. The young women started getting less healthy, and they had a lot of trouble with pregnancy and with birth. There was a huge increase in infant mortality and low birth weights and children going into foster care. And basically this highly, highly addictive drug started having massive negative impacts on a very specific part of the population. So there is some question of whether the American government was involved in this. Basically, if you look into the Contra schedule, you'll find it. And what we know is that definitely they were involved a little bit in trafficking, but whether they specifically meant to decimate the inner city black population is its own question. I'll let you decide, but they certainly didn't help. So basically, the things that you need to know about the difference between crack and cocaine are social. We expect a certain kind of person to do cocaine, and we expect a different kind of person to do crack. Even though they're the same drug, we think about them differently and we punish them differently. So now we can get back to our normal questions, and the next one is, what is it used for? And the answer with this one is basically just to get high. We used to use it medicinally, and sometimes people have used it to improve athletic performance. But most of the time with cocaine, it's a party drug, and with crack, it used to be a party drug, but most people are just using it because they can't stop. So what do we use it for? Almost exclusively for funsies. But people did used to use it athletically. Earlier in the century, it used to be pretty common to give cocaine to racehorses. These days, we don't allow that anymore. There are tests. It also used to be relatively common among baseball players. This guy on the right has admitted to very heavy cocaine use, and this guy in the middle once used cocaine in the middle of the Super Bowl. So, people have previously used it for athletic improvement, but these days we drug test for that, so it's not really as common. Our next question is, what does it do? And the answer with both of these drugs is that they're stimulants. So very much like our last drug, basically it stimulates your central nervous system and just makes everything go faster. But also with cocaine, it raises our level of dopamine. And like we've talked about, there's nothing we love more than dopamine. So the thing that cocaine does that people really like is it essentially re-ups your dopamine and your serotonin, as well as sort of speeding up the function of your brain. This is why it tends to be highly addictive. So our next question is, who uses it? And the answer with cocaine is basically whoever can afford it. Robin Williams once famously said that cocaine is God's way of telling you you have too much money. So we see cocaine use primarily in young adults who are using it to party, and especially in young adults that already have a pretty substantial amount of wealth. If we look at this map, we can see the cocaine use is actually more common in certain states than in others, and that's largely because it's more common in states where the young people can afford it. However, cocaine is on the decline. It's a party drug to be sure, but it's becoming eclipsed by other more popular party drugs. The question of who uses crack is a little bit different. Crack users tend to be primarily white, much like cocaine users, but usually they're poorer. They belong to a lower income class and they have a lower level of education. So one of the things that we see in terms of differences between these two drugs is who can afford which one, and again, crack is typically much cheaper. So if we look at this first graph, we can see the racial breakdown of who has used crack in the past month, and you'll notice that yes, it's primarily white people, but there is a larger percent of black people than there is with cocaine. In this graph, we're measuring people who have ever even tried it. And again, you'll notice that white people are much more likely to try it than black people, and that is consistent across the years. The one thing that you might find useful to know about who uses both crack and cocaine is basically how to spot someone who's using both of these things. So in this graph, we can see that if you're looking for a cocaine user, the best things to look for are runny noses, track marks, and of course, burned lips or fingers, especially in regard to people who smoke crack through glass crack pipes. So who uses these drugs? Fewer people in recent years than in past years, but still there's a vast difference between who we think uses cocaine and who we think uses crack. Our next question is, how much do we consume? And the answer here is kind of interesting, because if you're Elmo, you consume a lot. Really, the answer is interesting because we have to look at the whole world picture. So in America, it's a little bit on the decline, but worldwide, it might be the most popular illicit drug outside of cannabis. So if we look at this map, we can see that it's most popular in what we have traditionally called first world countries or developed countries. And of course, that's because it's expensive. But it comes from less developed countries, what we might call second or third world countries, which means that trafficking is one of the major problems that we see with cocaine, which means, of course, that trafficking is one of the major problems that leads to crack. So how much we do is very often determined by how much we can afford, of course, but also determined by where in the world you are. Our next question is, how much do we spend on this drug? And again, our answer is twofold. On the one hand, how much we spend on the drug. On the other hand, how much we spend preventing people from using the drug and punishing people when they do. So first, let's look at how much we spend on the drug itself. So this is a pretty complicated graph. There's a lot going on here, but I wanted to show it to you because it shows a pretty good example of the price difference between cocaine and crack. So cocaine is typically sold in entire grams, usually about 3.5 grams, maybe for about $150, whereas crack is sold in tenths of a gram, usually very small amounts. So a tenth of a gram might go for $25. This is mostly because crack is cut with other substances to make it less strong, but again, it's also because of the social differences between the two. In this graph, we can see that our spending on cocaine is actually on the decline, but this is not a good thing. This is usually because our spending on other drugs is on the incline, for instance, heroin and of course, methamphetamines. So how much we spend on this drug depends on which version of the drug that you're doing. A more important question is how much we spend punishing people who do the drug. Our next question is it harmful? And the answer here is an unequivocal yes. This is the first drug that we've talked about that can kill you the first time you do it. So the problem with cocaine and with crack both is the extent to which they function on your heart. These are very dangerous drugs. So what I'm going to show you next is a wall of text, and I apologize for that. But this is a great list of both the short-term effects and the long-term effects of both of these drugs. So the short-term effects have a lot to do with the increase in your central nervous system. There's a lot of information about hyperstimulation. It's hard for your heart, it's hard for your anxiety and that sort of thing. But the long-term effects are also very important. Malnutrition is a huge one, and of course, one of the most dangerous things is infectious diseases, especially if you're injecting the drugs and sharing needles with other users who inject the drugs. In this graph, we can see the number of deaths from cocaine. And the important thing that I wanted you to especially notice in this graph is that there's a strong difference between women who are dying from this drug and men who are dying from this drug. And perhaps unsurprisingly, men are dying at a higher rate, and this matches with what we've seen in a lot of the other drugs. The other graph that I wanted to show you is measuring cocaine deaths, but they're laying a second layer over this of use of other drugs, specifically opioids. So one of the things that you can see here is that people who use cocaine and opioids, especially at the same time, are more likely to die. This is no surprise. Using these two drugs together was definitely bound to kill you. So again, is this drug harmful? Yes, this is one of the most harmful drugs that we've talked about yet. Our next question is it addictive? And the answer here, once again, is yes. This is a highly addictive drug in both of its forms, but it's worth noting that it's a little bit more addictive as crack than it is as cocaine because it hits faster and it hits harder. So for a lot of people, they become addicted to crack quickly because the high is intense and it's also short. So you have to spend a lot more time finding the drug and doing the drug as compared to a drug that lasts for a longer period of time. Our next question is, who is addicted? And again, much like everything else we've talked about so far, it has a lot to do with sociology. Essentially, it has a lot to do with race and a lot to do with wealth. The people who are addicted to cocaine are the people who can afford cocaine. It's almost exclusively upper-class white people. The people who are addicted to crack are the people who can afford crack. It's almost exclusively lower-class black people. We do see that men tend to get addicted at higher levels than women, but again, we think this is sociological. We think that has to do with access, and it has to do with the amount that a person thinks that they can handle, and it has to do with who's most likely to sell. It's very common for people who are addicted to sell to support their habit. So who is addicted to these drugs? A pretty high percentage of people who use them. This is certainly a highly addictive drug, so once you start using it, the odds that you will become addicted are much higher than any of the drugs we've talked about so far. So our next question is it legal? And this is where it starts to get interesting. So is it legal? No, neither one of them are legal. Cocaine was made illegal in 1914, and crack was made illegal basically as soon as we invented it in the 80s. Where it gets weird is how we punish people for doing this drug. So the first thing that we need to talk about is sentencing disparities. So let's look at this first graph. So when we talk about sentencing disparities, what we're talking about is how much time you have to do in jail based on how much of the drug you had on you when you were arrested. And the thing that's interesting about this is that for a long, long time, it was a 100-to-1 ratio. So if we look at this graph, this is a pretty good pictorial demonstration of what I'm talking about. So if you had basically about 1¼ teaspoons of crack cocaine, that would give you 5 years, whereas you would need to have roughly 2½ cups of powder cocaine to get the same sentence. And this lasted up until 2010, which is when we passed the Fair Sentencing Act, and then they've reduced it down to a way more manageable 18-to-1. So, I'm joking when I say manageable because we're still looking at a ratio of roughly 1¼ teaspoons to 1/2 cup, so it's still not fair, but the reason that the sentencing disparities are so big is once again down to race. So let's look at this next graph. Here we're seeing whether the people who get arrested for cocaine are white or black versus whether the people who get arrested for crack are white or black. On the right, you'll see that we arrest far more people for powder cocaine who are white, whereas on the left, you'll see that we arrest far more people for crack cocaine who are black. So this is why it's sociological. There's very clearly an element of race here. Once again, even though these are basically the same drug, we are much, much, much more concerned about crack, and we are much, much, much more concerned about crack because it's mostly black people who are doing it. So this is one of the ways that we see a huge impact in America on the black population. We decided that this drug was worse, and we decided that people should serve heavier sentences. So this next graph is a little bit old, but it's a great visual example of what I've been talking about. So prior to the Fair Sentencing Act, this is exactly the kind of thing that we were looking at. On the left, you can see the racial difference between crack cocaine offenders. Essentially, they're 82% black, the amount of people who get arrested for it. But on the right, you can see the difference in their sentences. So essentially, for a person to get a 5-year sentence, the amount of crack that they had to have on them was 5 grams, and the amount of powder cocaine they had to have on them was 500 grams. So again, this was prior to the change that we made in 2010, but it's a really good visual example of the ways in which our sentencing guidelines were based almost exclusively on race. In this next graph, what we're measuring is the level of drug use and/or drug sales that the people were doing when they got arrested. So in blue, we're looking at crack, and in red, we're looking at cocaine. And as you can see, one of our primary concerns, of course, is wholesalers, and they tend to get arrested at roughly the same rate. But interestingly, we're extremely anxious to arrest street dealer level crack dealers, and we're more interested in arresting big-time smugglers in regard to cocaine. So essentially, we want to arrest users of crack and dealers of cocaine. And again, that has a lot to do with who we want to see getting in trouble and what kind of neighborhoods we're looking for these drugs and these drug users in. In this next graph, we're looking at sentencing disparities between people of different races, but I wanted to show it to you because it's also looking at sentencing disparities between different drugs. So the first thing you'll notice when you look at this graph is that we're definitely arresting Hispanic people at a way higher rate than would be logical considering the percent of the population they make, which is of course its own problem. And the only thing that we tend to arrest white people for at a really high level is meth. But if we look over here at powder cocaine, you can see once again that we're arresting black people at a way higher rate than white people, and Hispanic people at an even higher rate than that. And if we look at crack cocaine, we're arresting black people at a much, much higher level than anyone else. So in regard to sentencing disparities in race, it's pretty clear that there are racial connotations across every single drug. So as I mentioned earlier, in 2010, we did pass the Fair Sentencing Act. And the goal of this act was to start narrowing the difference between how we punish people of different races for essentially the same crime. So if we look at this graph, we can see that the disparity between crack cocaine sentences and powder cocaine sentences has become smaller. This is progress. Again, we haven't fixed the problem entirely, and we did cause a great amount of damage in regard to systemic racism with our policies regarding crack cocaine and powder cocaine, but we can say at least it's on the decline, which is a tiny bit hopeful. Our final question, of course, is it socially acceptable? And the answer to this will not surprise you. Basically, it has a lot to do with who you are, what you look like, and what kind of party you're at. So, first of all, is cocaine socially acceptable? The answer is, I don't know, kind of depends on who you are and when you are. In this graph, we can see that whether or not you think cocaine is acceptable has a lot to do with how old you are. Obviously, people who are in their 20s tend to think it's more acceptable than people in other age groups. You'll also notice that people who use cocaine think it's more acceptable. That's probably no accident. Another thing that's interesting is that even though generally we think that crack is unacceptable, we like to make a lot of jokes about how other things are like crack. But even weirder than that, it's almost exclusively young white women who make these jokes. As you can see in these memes, this kind of annoys people who actually do crack or who have actually been addicted to crack. So if you are a young white woman, you probably should stop saying that your cheese dip is like crack, because, it's not. My favorite example of whether one drug is more socially acceptable than the other drug is Whitney Houston. So once upon a time, someone accused Whitney Houston of being a crack addict, and she got mad. But interestingly, she wasn't mad because they assumed that she was on drugs. She was mad because they assumed that she was on what she thought was a cheap drug. She was mad because they assumed that she didn't have enough money to do other drugs. So essentially, she said, "I make too much money to ever smoke crack." So, are these drugs socially acceptable? It depends. One is certainly more socially acceptable than the other, but whether or not they're socially acceptable is almost exclusively down to sociological reasoning. So, like Whitney said, crack is whack. Don't do it. I agree with her, at least on that part. I'll see you guys again next week when we continue to talk about pretty serious drugs. Next week, we're going to get into methamphetamines, so stay tuned.